Poornima Luthra, welcome to the stage.
Thank you.
We are going to dive into the research perspective because you are working with the CPS, working as an associate professor at CBS. You're also an author, written several books about diversity and inclusion, and a bit of a diversity and inclusion expert, not exclusion.
Not exclusion.
No, definitely not exclusion. But maybe when we speak about inclusion, that is actually also about exclusion. So we want to move from exclusion to inclusion. Anyway, Poornima, good to have you here on stage. We just had a few remarks here to give us an idea of from where you come. But what do you think companies are missing out on when they do not succeed in including neurodivergent employees?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of research to back this, right? And when we look at the research, it's actually very clear that, and we've seen some of that data today, right? Looking at employees who are looking at problems, looking at solutions, pattern recognition in very different ways from the neurotypical employee. And that adds tremendous value. When you look at our organizations today, one of the key things is about how we're going to be sustainable for the future, how we're going to be innovative and creative. And when we think about the value that neurodivergent individuals add to this, it is incredible. And there's good data to support this. We also see in organizations that autistic individuals are about 140% more productive than neurotypical individuals. And so there's a real case for organizations to embrace this. I guess the question we need to ask ourselves is, why are we not embracing it, right? What is it that's stopping us?
Exactly, and maybe on leader management level, because we heard an excellent example from Danske Bank where it's really anchored at the top of the organization. That is not the case everywhere and always. So when you look into leaders, managers, what do they find difficult?
Yeah, so I'm going to ask the audience here today, how many of you have had a chance to bake cookies before? Brilliant. How many of you have a chance to buy cookies from a supermarket or bakery? Super. One of the hallmarks of a good batch of cookies, now some of you will say it needs to have great butter, good ingredients, chocolate chips, all valid, but it's also that when we buy a batch of cookies, we expect them to look the same. In our organizations, we are plagued with what I call the cookie cutter phenomenon. The cookie cutter syndrome. We have a certain prototype, a certain mold of who is considered to be the ideal employee, the ideal leader in the organization. And one of the characteristics that we're looking for is neurotypical behaviors. And we also have a stereotype, a cookie cutter, of who someone who's neurodivergent is. As we have seen today from the amazing panel earlier, that some of our stereotypes and biases that we have about who someone is, who's neurodivergent, that needs to be challenged. So one of the biggest things that I would ask leaders to think about are these cookie cutters. Who are these cookie cutters at play, and how do we melt these cookie cutters down? And one of the things that's standing in the way, as you asked, is really fear. We like to hire people who are like us. We like to hire people where we know it's going to work. And these cookie cutters work. They've worked in the past, and we assume they're going to work today and in the future as well. So we continue to hire people who are very much that cookie cutter. But the fear is really what is keeping us from actually taking that next step, to hiring people who are different, not seeing them as a risk, but seeing the value that they add to the organization.
But what do you think it takes to break that bias?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. Number one, when we talk about bias, is first understanding that everyone is biased. As I write on the back of my first book, if you have a brain, you are biased. Everybody is biased. And so we have to first become aware of the bias, and then we have to intentionally and consciously put in measures to be able to block bias. And that can be done across the entire employee life cycle, from thinking about who we're attracting to the organization to how they're being recruited, the selection process, how they're being developed in our organizations. And that's a really big part of it. It's bias blockers. How do we put intentional efforts into blocking that bias?
But do you think it comes down to lack of knowledge?
I think to some extent. I think we're all learning creatures. Human beings are learning creatures, and we've been socially conditioned over the many decades that we've been around to assume that things are a particular way. We're also busy individuals, right? And there are milestones and deliverables and deadlines and targets and all of that. Now, in that environment, actually 95% of our decision making actually takes place through that quick, intuitive decision making.
Yeah.
So we need to learn how to slow down, and we need to make choices about where we're slowing down. And when leadership and organization prioritizes who we're hiring as one of those areas where we're going to slow down and make more conscious decisions for doing the right thing and also the value that it adds to the organization. And these are not in opposition to each other.
And I guess, but we spoke about earlier here on stage that diversity is actually, it's a net gain for an organization because it's really good to have diverse teams. And I guess that is backed by research.
Absolutely. There's tons of research that shows that there's a strong business case for this. There's, of course, the financial side to it, but I'd like to think that there's more than the financial metrics that really drives organizations. It's, it's creativity, innovation, better decision-making, well-being of employees. Representation matters. You can't see what we can't, you can't be what you can't see. So for inspiring the next generations as well. Now, we've seen a data point today that about 15% of the workforce today is neurodivergent. When we look at younger talent who's coming into our workplaces, Generation Z, Generation Alpha, 1 in 5 children today are being diagnosed as neurodivergent, which means that's 20% of our future talent pool. And if we say that 66% to about 87% of neurodivergent individuals are actually not unemployed right now, that's a huge talent pool that we're simply missing out on. And it's not just the right thing to do, it is about the talent that we're missing out on, the value that they're able to add just because of the cookie cutters.
So it's really a necessity for companies to work out how to deal with this if they want to exist in the future and be able to attract talent. So Poornima, when we spoke earlier, you said we do actually in Denmark have a pretty good starting point for embarking on this journey because we have a high level of trust. Can you develop how these things are interconnected?
Absolutely. So trust, I think Carsten mentioned this just now as well. Trust is a huge part of this. We trust people who are like us. In homogeneity and in homogeneous environments, it's easy to trust people. It's easy to trust people who behave like us, who think like us, who learn like us. The question is, how can we use this trust and expand our trust to actually trust people who are different from ourselves? And for a lot of the things that we need in place, the systemic change, the cultural change that is needed to support neurodivergent individuals, including things like flexible working, accommodations within the workplace environment, it requires us to trust people who might do things very different from ourselves. But it's not to say that our way is the right way, neurotypical way is the right way. It's to say that there are different ways and the outcomes can actually be better than we could have ever imagined.
Yeah. So it has to come down to trust, the fact that we trust that people will solve their tasks, and that's a pretty good starting point. Actually.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Poornima, great to have you here.
Thank you
very much for
Thank you
joining.
very much.